Hormuz burns. 2 words. That is all the tactical action officer needed to say when the first contact resolved on the SPY-1D phased array at 2:47 a.m. 2 words that compressed 3 weeks of escalating regional conflict, 47 years of Iranian naval doctrine, and the entire calculus of asymmetric warfare into a single, gut-level acknowledgement that the situation had just crossed the threshold from tense transit to active combat engagement. The U.S. Navy Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer had entered the Strait of Hormuz at 2:31 a.m. under strict emissions control, running with reduced radar output to minimize its electronic signature. The strait at this hour was a darkness so complete it felt deliberate. No commercial traffic, no fishing vessels, no tankers. The absence of shipping was itself a signal. Every merchant captain with a Lloyd's of London insurance policy had been rerouting through the Cape of Good Hope for 11 days. Ever since satellite imagery first confirmed Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps engineering teams operating in the shallow waters between Qeshm Island and the Omani coastline. The word was already out in the maritime community. The Strait of Hormuz had become a contested waterway, and no hull made of steel and carrying a cargo of hydrocarbons was worth the risk of finding out exactly how contested. But a U.S. Navy warship does not reroute. A U.S. Navy warship goes through. That was the doctrine. That was the mission. That was the reason the Combat Information Center smelled of recycled air and quiet tension at 2:31 a.m., with 17 sailors hunched over screens that painted the world in luminescent green and amber, their fingers resting on interfaces that could, within a legally authorized chain of decisions, direct the firepower of a floating weapons platform, capable of engaging threats from the surface to the upper atmosphere. By 2:47 a.m., every one of those 17 sailors had stopped breathing normally. The contacts appeared in sequence, not simultaneously, which was worse. A simultaneous burst would suggest a technical glitch, a radar artifact, a software ghost. Sequential resolution meant something was actually out there, something with staggered launch timing and coordinated approach. Vectors. Something that had been planned. In the space of 41 seconds, the track count climbed from 0 to 11 to 23 to 31. By the time the tactical action officer made his initial transmission to the commanding officer's sea cabin, the number had settled at 47 discrete aerial contacts, all inbound, all bearing low radar cross-sections consistent with commercially derived one-way attack drone. Airframes, packed with shape-charge warheads. 47 targets. The Combat Information Center's ambient lighting shifted automatically to red as the system declared Condition 1. The smell of ozone intensified. That particular sharp metallic scent that comes from electronic systems working beyond their routine parameters. From phase arrays scanning at maximum power. From cooling systems that were suddenly competing with thermal loads. The engineers had modeled but hoped would remain theoretical. The deck vibrated with a low-frequency tremor as the engineering plant responded to the demand signal for maximum available power. The tactical action officer did not pause. The rules of engagement had been updated 9 days ago to authorize immediate defensive action against any unmanned aerial system, demonstrating hostile intent within the maritime exclusion zone. 47 inbound contacts with terminal approach vectors locked on a U.S. warship constituted hostile intent by any reasonable definition. At 2:48 a.m., the first vertical launch cell fired. The Standard Missile-6 left the forward VLS magazine with a pressure wave that registered on every sailor's chest like a physical punch. A concussive percussion that was simultaneously terrifying and reassuring. Terrifying because of what it confirmed about the reality of the threat. Reassuring because the ship was fighting back. The exhaust bloom lit the strait for 3 seconds with a magnesium-white light that turned the surrounding darkness into something momentarily resembling early morning. Then, a second cell fired. A third. The tactical action officer was allocating interceptors at a rate the system's engagement scheduling software had only ever processed during simulation. The math was unforgiving. 47 incoming targets. At the drone airframe's estimated approach velocity, the outer engagement envelope gave the ship approximately 6 minutes of intercept opportunity at range. But those 6 minutes were not 6 minutes of calm deliberation. They were 6 minutes of simultaneous tracking, fire control correlation, interceptor allocation, and terminal guidance management, all of it running on hardware that was, in this moment, the single most complex autonomous battle management system ever fielded, operated by human beings whose hands were shaking. In the first engagement tier, at a range of approximately 31 nautical miles, the SM-6 interceptors began their work. The first 3 drone contacts disappeared from the tactical display within 90 seconds. Clean intercepts, airframe disintegration at altitude, debris patterns consistent with total loss of asset. The tactical action officer allowed himself a single breath of partial relief. Then the system flagged something that made his stomach drop. 17 of the 47 contacts had altered their flight profiles. Not randomly. Coordinated. 3 distinct groups of 5 to 7 airframes had simultaneously descended below 50 feet of altitude, trading radar detectability for terrain masking in the shallow wave environment of the strait. They had waited, deliberately waited, for the first SM-6 launches to confirm the ship's engagement priority, before executing a pre-planned sea-skimming transition that dramatically reduced the effectiveness of the ship's fire control solution at long range. The enemy was thinking. That was the thing that no simulation had fully captured. The visceral reality of an adversary that was not simply executing a script, but actively adapting to the defensive response in real time. Someone, somewhere, was watching the engagement unfold and adjusting the attack geometry. The drone swarm had a human intelligence behind it, and that intelligence had just demonstrated that it had anticipated the outer engagement layer and engineered a countermeasure. At 2:51 a.m., a secondary alarm registered on the port side SPQ-9B gunfire control radar. Not a drone contact. Something different. Larger. Faster. The electronic warfare suite identified the emission signature in 1.3 seconds, and the classification appeared on the tactical action officer's display in a font that felt too calm for the information it was conveying. Fast attack craft, IRGC type, bearing 247, range 8.4 nautical miles, speed 38 knots, count 4. This was the desperation move. Or rather, it was not desperation at all. It was the second layer of a carefully designed saturation architecture. The drone swarm had been intended from the beginning to force the ship's defensive systems and crew attention upward and outward and see to Cosinam CCR Derwana Diet or Enidia Neuratory cognitive bandwidth, and then, in the window created by that consumption, to send fast surface platforms racing across the shallow water with enough speed and surprise to complicate the fire control picture beyond manageable limits. The commanding officer arrived in the Combat Information Center at 2:51:40 a.m. He took exactly 4 seconds to assess the tactical display before authorizing immediate engagement of the surface contacts with the ship's 5-inch gun and transition of the remaining SM-6 inventory to the highest priority inbound drone tracks. From 2:52 a.m. to 2:54 a.m., the ship was fighting simultaneously in 3 dimensions. The 5-inch gun began cyclic fire at the approaching surface contacts, its barrel traversing in controlled arcs, each round a kinetic argument against the fast attack craft's continued approach. The forward VLS expended its remaining SM-6 allocation against the highest threat drone tracks. The launches so rapid that the exhaust plumes overlapped into a continuous column of white smoke, visible on the ship's own thermal imaging. And in the electronic warfare space, the ship's systems were pumping jamming energy across multiple frequency bands in an attempt to disrupt the data links connecting the incoming drone airframes to whatever command and control architecture was guiding their terminal navigation. One of the fast attack craft was neutralized at 4.2 nautical miles. A direct hit that produced a secondary explosion visible to the naked eye from the ship's bridge as a brilliant orange flash low on the water. The second craft broke off its approach at 3.8 miles, turning hard to the south at a speed suggesting that someone aboard had made a survival calculation. The third and fourth craft continued to close, apparently operating under a commitment that no longer included personal survival as a variable. In the Combat Information Center, the electronic warfare supervisor reported a critical development at 2:53 a.m. The radar cooling subsystem on the aft SPY-1D array face was showing thermal overload indicators. The system had been running at sustained maximum power output for 6 minutes. a duration the thermal management architecture could support for periods of up to 8 minutes before automatic power reduction algorithms would begin degrading the radar's sensitivity. The tactical action officer had approximately 2 minutes before the ship's primary sensor would begin to go partially blind in its aft quadrant. This was not a scenario. This was not a simulation. This was a 9,200-ton warship in a contested strait, with a degrading sensor engaging a multi-axis threat, while 31 drone airframes continued their terminal approach, and 2 fast attack craft were still closing at speed. The evolved Sea Sparrow missile system began its engagement sequence at 2:53:30 a.m. The ESSM was designed for exactly this scenario: the inner defensive ring, the engagements that the outer systems had not resolved, the threats that had survived long enough to reach the threat rings that made the crew's breathing rate spike regardless of their training. The quad-packed cells in the VLS gave the system rapid-fire capability, and in the next 90 seconds the sky around the ship became a canvas of white smoke trails, arcing in every direction. Each one a subsonic signature of a weapon traveling faster than the eye could track, seeking a drone airframe with seeker logic that had to discriminate between legitimate threats and sea clutter, and jamming and debris from previous intercepts, all in an electromagnetic environment that was now saturated with interference from both sides. 19 drone contacts were eliminated in the ESSM engagement window. At 2:55 a.m., the aft SPY-1D array reduced power by 14%. The tactical action officer noted the degradation indicator and did not react visibly. There was no visible reaction available that would improve the situation. He rerouted fire control responsibility for the aft quadrant to the forward array's coverage overlap, and accepted that the geometry of the engagement had just gotten measurably harder. 6 drone contacts had broken through the SM-6 and ESSM engagement layers. 6 airframes, each carrying a shaped charge sufficient to penetrate the ship's superstructure and initiate significant damage to internal systems, were now inside 2 nautical miles and closing at speeds that gave the CYWS, the Phalanx Close-In Weapon System, approximately 40 seconds of engagement opportunity. The Phalanx director slewed to the first contact at 2:55:18 a.m. The system is autonomous in its terminal engagement phase, a deliberate design choice born from the recognition that human reaction time is not fast enough to operate effectively at the ranges and speeds involved. The 20mm M61A1 rotary cannon spun up to its operational fire rate, and the sound it produced was unlike any other sound in the naval combat vocabulary. It was not a bang, or a boom, or a crack. It was a sustained mechanical shriek, a sound like reality itself being torn apart at a granular level, a continuous ripping noise that lasted approximately 1 second per engagement, and in that 1 second expelled a quantity of tungsten projectiles sufficient to reduce an airframe to fragments. The first contact was eliminated at 847 yards, the second at 612 yards, the third at 481 yards. The fourth contact had executed a terminal pop-up maneuver, a pre-programmed guidance command that caused the airframe to climb sharply from its wave-skimming profile to an altitude of approximately 60 feet, changing its intercept geometry and forcing the Phalanx director to reacquire. The system managed it. The contact was eliminated at 203 yards. 203 yards. The crew in the aft damage control station felt the concussive displacement of the airframe's disintegration as a physical pressure event. A sharp, ear-compressing overpressure that rattled equipment on its mounts and caused 2 sailors to instinctively drop to the deck before cognitive processing caught up with physiological response and informed them that they were still alive, that the ship was still intact, that the system had worked. The fifth contact was taken by a co-engaged ESSM in its outermost terminal phase, eliminated at 1,100 yards. The sixth contact, the final inbound airframe, a drone that had flown 47 nautical miles through a defensive gauntlet that had expended the majority of a destroyer's interceptor inventory trying to eliminate it, broke through everything, every layer, every ring. It crossed the 500-yard threshold and the 300-yard threshold, and the Phalanx director was already tracking it. But the contact was at an oblique angle that placed it in the edge of the weapon system's elevation, coverage, and for 2.3 seconds there was genuine uncertainty in the Combat Information Center about whether the terminal engagement would succeed. A petty officer at the electronic warfare console later said in his incident debrief that he had smelled heat. Not the electrical heat of his own equipment. Something external. Something coming from the direction of the starboard quarter. The thermal plume of a jet turbine engine at full thrust. Close enough that the ventilation intake on the bridge wing was pulling its exhaust into the ship's internal atmosphere. He said it smelled like burning kerosene and scorched metal, and the specific kind of fear that has no intellectual component, only physical. The phalanx completed its reacquisition. The 20mm cannon engaged. The sixth contact was eliminated at 31 yards from the hull of a U.S. Navy-guided missile destroyer. The debris pattern from the airframe's disintegration impacted the ship's superstructure at 3 points, leaving scoring marks on the paint and a single penetration of an outboard antenna assembly that would require dry dock maintenance to properly repair. No personnel were injured. No internal systems were compromised. The ship's pressure hull remained intact. At 2:56:44 a.m., the Combat Information Center radar displays showed 0 inbound aerial contacts. The tactical action officer made the call to maintain Condition 1 and tasked the ship's helicopter, still airborne on a holding pattern to the south, to conduct a battle damage assessment sweep of the engagement area, while the ship's electronic warfare suite continued to monitor for any residual threat emissions. The 2 fast attack craft that had continued to close were neutralized by the 5-inch gun at 3.1 and 2.7 nautical miles respectively, their hulls rendered inoperable and beginning to settle in the shallow waters of the Strait's northern channel. The Combat Information Center was silent for approximately 4 seconds after the final threat was eliminated. Not a comfortable silence. Not a relieved silence. A silence with a specific quality. The sound of 17 human beings processing the gap between what had just happened and the fact that they were still present to process it. The commanding officer stood at the center console and looked at the tactical display for a long time. The display showed a clean picture. Empty airspace. Settled surface contacts. A strait through which the ship could continue to transit without further immediate threat. He looked at the ammunition status panel. He looked at the thermal overload indicator still blinking amber on the aft radar face. He looked at the debris score marks on the external camera feed from the starboard superstructure. Then he made his transmission to Fleet Command. Transit complete. Multiple threats engaged and eliminated. Ship operational. Continuing to assigned patrol area. The numbers were entered into the engagement log at 3:02 a.m. 47 drone airframes launched against a single U.S. Navy warship. 4 IRGC fast attack craft committed to a surface engagement. 112 seconds of active multi-domain combat. 31 SM-6 and ESSM interceptors expended. 4,216 rounds of 20mm ammunition fired by the CIWS in its terminal engagements. 41 5-inch rounds engaged against surface contacts. 1 guided missile destroyer. Hull integrity intact. Crew uninjured, continuing to assign station. The cost of that outcome was not trivial. The ship's VLS magazine had been reduced from full capacity to 31% of its interceptor inventory in under 3 minutes of combat. The aft radar array required maintenance. The antenna assembly penetration was a structural repair item. The commanding officer's formal after-action report would note that if a second coordinated saturation attack of equivalent scale had been launched within the following 4 hours, the ship's ability to defend itself at the outer engagement rings would have been significantly degraded, and the outcome of a second engagement could not have been predicted with confidence. 1 ship, 1 crew, 1 engagement, 1 night in a strait that the world's energy economy depends on, defended by 18 sailors in a red-lit room and the most sophisticated weapons integration architecture ever mounted on a surface vessel. The ocean did not notice the engagement. The ocean never does. But the men and women who stood that watch on that night in that strait will carry the specific weight of those 112 seconds. The smell of heat at 31 yards. The sound of the phalanx at its operational fire rate. The 4 seconds of silence after the last contact disappeared. For the rest of their lives, long after the maintenance records are filed and the ammunition manifests are restocked, and the scoring marks on the superstructure are painted over. The Strait of Hormuz has been contested for decades, but on this night it was held. Not by doctrine and not by hardware. By people who did not flinch when flinching was the only human response available to them. The line between free passage and closed sea is not drawn in water. It is maintained, second by second, by those who stand in the red light and refuse to yield the display, until the next engagement is logged.